Let's go ahead and open it back up to 1 Corinthians chapter 10, and we're going to resume our lesson that we were talking about this morning about how the past matters. We've already talked about, if you remember, we've already talked about the Exodus and how God was with them and how that definitely applies to us today as we think about our spiritual state and how we feast on Jesus and how He gives us that living water and our baptism even. And we talked about how we should learn from their wilderness wanderings. We should learn not to grumble, not to commit idolatry, not to practice sexual immorality, and not to do any of these things that for which these people were done away with. But the scripture reading this morning, if you remember, that Ryan read for us was 11 through 13. And in 11 through 13, we first look at, in 11 and 12, we see the purpose. The purpose for God giving us the past, the purpose for God giving us the Old Testament. The reason we have the Old Testament in our hands, here's part of, at least, part of the purpose for which we have it. Read with me verse 11 and verse 12. Now these things happened to them, talking about all the things we've already talked about. Now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come. Therefore let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall. The purpose for which these things have happened in the past and the purpose for which we have them right now is first and foremost in verse 11 so that we can learn from the past. If you don't learn from the past, guess what? You are doomed to repeat it. Do you want to repeat these things? Do you want to undergo again the wrath of God? We see that even though God did all these incredible and spiritual things as He led them through the wilderness, He gave them water to drink, He gave them food to eat, He led them by the cloud, He went through the Red Sea, they still perished. Look at verse 5. They still perished, verse 5. And although they were God's chosen people, when they committed sexual immorality, He still punished them. And although they were God's chosen people, when they practiced idolatry, He punished them. And although they were God's chosen people, when they sinned against Him, He always punishes. You know why? Because God is a just God. God is a kind God, and God is a patient God. But the one reason we have these things is so that we can learn from them, so that we don't do the same things. There's this passage, or a couple of passages, where Paul says almost the same thing in a different way. First in Romans chapter 15, look at verse 4 with me. For whatever was written in former days was written for our instruction, that through endurance and through encouragement of the Scriptures we might have hope, right? So these things that happen in the Old Testament, these things that God has written down for us, these were written so that we can learn from them. And if you don't learn from them, you are destined to repeat them. We've got to learn from the mistakes of others. You know, there's a huge, gargantuan, I don't know how many of you other people are the last child, but there's a huge advantage to being the youngest in the family. You watch your older brother and your two older sisters grow up, and they make a lot of mistakes, and mom and dad get mad at them for doing a lot of different things. And guess what? You come along and you don't do those same things. You do different things. But you're still treated as the perfect child because you weren't like your brother or your sister. It's a little bit different with God, but it's the same concept, isn't it? We as the children of God, we can learn from our elder brother, the Israelites, the Jews, what to expect from God. These things were written for our instruction. Look at another passage with me. In Galatians chapter 3. Here in Galatians chapter 3, verse 24 and verse 25, look at what it says here. So the law was our guardian until Christ came in order that we might be justified by faith. Now, that faith has come. We are no longer under a guardian. So this is the Old Testament, the Old Law, the scriptures that we have before us. Those were our guardian. Maybe the translation that you're reading says tutor, or I think it's the King James that says schoolmaster. This was the Old Testament. It is our instructor. Now, the way that this word is used in the secular, it's only used 3 times in the New Testament, but the way that this word is used in the secular sense was, in many instances, it was referred to a slave, a household slave, one that was in charge of raising the children. So in a very similar sense, the Old Testament is our guardian in that it teaches us about God. It teaches us about His nature and His character so that when we are mature, we can fully appreciate. It is our guardian, our teacher, our tutor. What's the purpose? What was the purpose of all of this? Until Christ came. It was to bring us to the point where we can have a relationship with God. We see, if we continue, in order that we might be justified by faith. And we now know in verse 25 that this faith has come so that we no longer have to be under the guardian or the tutorship or this teaching of this schoolmaster. Now we are under Christ. We are under the head. We are supposed to, in verse 11, going back to our text, 1 Corinthians 10, we are supposed to learn from the past. That's one of the purposes. Another, if you go back and you reread verse 12, you see something else. That we are to take heed. These things were written so that we should take heed, so that we should pay attention. Therefore, let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall. Let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall. Now, if you remember, we've looked at this comparison several times, but the Jews, they didn't think that Jesus was the Messiah. They didn't think that it was even possible. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? Right? I mean, how is this even possible? And cursed is the one that hangs on the tree. The Jews didn't think that Jesus was the Messiah, and many of them still today do not. And the Gentiles, I mean, are you serious? A resurrection from the dead? No, that doesn't even make any sense. Let the one that thinks that he stands take heed. There are far too often and far too many people in this world that think they know more than what God tells us. Look at this passage with me in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. I believe this is a group of people that need to take heed. Beginning in verse 20, it says, "Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God through folly of what we preach to save those who believe. For the Jews demand signs and Greeks seek wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews and folly to the Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God." For in verse 25, "For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men." Man, if that doesn't speak volumes, shouldn't we, as believers in God, take heed in the wisdom of God? Shouldn't we pay careful attention when we think that we've got life figured out? Watch out. When we think that we know, we need to remember that it's not in man to direct his steps. We need more and more dependence upon God. Let's go back to this passage. The purpose we see in verse 11, we see that we should learn from the past. We also see that we need to take heed in verse 12 of all the things that have gone on before us, because we need to learn from them. And in verse 13, the most familiar passage to many of us, we have the promises. At least three for our purposes, at least three promises for us to pay careful attention to. We have first, no temptation. Let's read it together. No temptation is overtaking you that is not common to man. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape, that you may be able to endure it. Promise number one, there is no unique temptation. I don't care who you are, where you live, what you're going through. There ain't anything new that you could experience that hasn't already been experienced. There's nothing that you're going through that hasn't been gone through before. I don't know about you, but that's a little comforting, isn't it? It's a little comforting to me to know that this isn't new to me. Or it's not new to the world that there are brothers and sisters in the world that can experience the same thing. There's nothing new. It reminds me of what Solomon was saying in Proverbs. There's nothing new under the sun, is there? Is that he said, I've tried everything. I've tried to find happiness in everything, and in everything I just find more and more vanity. But with the temptation, isn't that a little bit comforting? That there is nothing new, and that our brothers and sisters all over the world experience temptations just like we do. Another promise, if you continue reading, hinges on the next three words. God is faithful. Underline that. Highlight that. God is faithful. Let me tell you something. God was faithful. God is faithful, and God always will be faithful. In all things, at all times, in every single situation, God is faithful. So when you find yourself facing Satan, when you find yourself facing temptation, remember, God is faithful. God hasn't changed. God is still faithful. Now, let's build on that a little bit. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. The faithfulness of God, the fidelity of God gives us something that we can trust in. How sad would it be if you were trusting in something that you could not depend on? That you were trusting in someone that you couldn't ever depend on. You wouldn't know if he was there. You wouldn't even know if he cares. But God not only cares, God gives us this promise. There is nothing beyond your ability. You know what that tells me? First, that tells me God cares. God cares about what you're going through. Second, it tells me God knows your ability. If that doesn't give you chills, I don't know what will. God knows what you are able to do. 7 billion people in the world? Me? Measly, pitiful, worthless me. God knows my ability. Even when sometimes I don't know it myself, God knows my ability. It also tells me, number 3, tells me that God has more power than Satan does. Satan wants you. Satan is trying his very best to get you. But God will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. God's more powerful than Satan. Shouldn't we find courage in that? That we serve a God that will not allow us to be tempted beyond our ability? The third promise here in verse 13 is that you can escape. God is faithful, and He will not let you be tempted beyond your ability, but with the temptation, He will also provide the way of escape, that you may be able to endure it. Oh boy. Wouldn't it be nice if He just said, He will not tempt you. There will be no temptation. That's not what He says, is it? But with the temptation, He will provide a way of escape. That says temptation's coming. It's on its way. Be sober, be watchful. The devil prowls around like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour. The temptation is coming. But always remember, there is a way out. You can see temptation, and when you see temptation, God has always and always will provide a way to escape. Stop and think about that for a minute. Okay, 7 billion people. I don't know, is that right? Give or take a couple hundred? 7 billion people. And that God cares enough for you, and He knows what you're going through, that He's going to provide a way out. Isn't that incredible? I mean temptations, they're always happening, but God is always providing a way out. I mean, Satan, he's constantly coming, but God is one step ahead all the way. We serve a great God, a powerful God, and a God that's even more powerful than Satan. When it seems as if we have to throw our hands up, remember, God's providing a door, God's providing a window, God's providing a way out. It may not be an easy way out. Jacob had to run away, or Joseph had to run away without part of his clothes. It may not be easy to get out, but you can. You most certainly can. That's the promise. And don't take chapter 10 and verse 13 out of its context, because if you do, it loses a bit of its power. Look at what God has done. Look at how God has taken care of His people. Look at how richly God has provided for those who have been called by His name. All the way back in the past. All the way back to Moses. And God has always, in every single one of these situations, provided a way out. God has always provided a way out. Isn't that amazing? God always provided a way out. And yet, they practice idolatry, sexual immorality. They tested God. They grumbled. Don't do those things. Because God is just. We need to learn from the past. If there's one thing that we can learn from the past, it is we serve a great and a gracious God. And He will forgive our iniquities every time that we come and we ask for His forgiveness. If that's what you need, if you're subject to the invitation, please come as we stand and as we sing.